Good morning. Recording is in progress, so we can start this seminar on Middle East crisis. My name is Alessandro Lanza. I'm Executive Director of this institution, Fondazione Enrico Mattei. And let's say that we organize this kind of activity, I would say, once per month. And what is clear from my experience now that you need to have first an issue, a topic that of course has a general interest, and then you need to have real experts, people that could bring experience and activity. I think I will say a few words later on, but I keep just the 2 minutes that I was allowed to use, and I give the floor to Federico Pontoni for the rest of this short introduction. Then we will start with our welcome speakers. Federico.
Thank you, Alessandro, and again, good morning, everyone. We are glad that you're joining our webinar. Today we will have very important speakers. So the event will be, first of all, moderated by Umberto Tavolato, who is the director of the special events of the Medora Foundation, who is also co-organizing this webinar. And then we have 3 keynote speakers. First, Dr. Sima, who is a senior advisor from the Institute of National Security Studies. Then we have Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of the Gulf State Analytics. And we will also have a very important presentation on the energy consequences of this crisis that will be presented by Andreas, Professor Economou from the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, where he leads where he is the head of the oil market research. Before leaving the stage to the moderator, I just want you to know that basically you can, we will have at the end of the webinar a Q&A session, and you can type in the chat your questions, and you can feel free to write any kind of questions that you want to address to one of our speakers, and we will keep at least 15 minutes to go through some of the questions. Without further ado, I leave the stage to Umberto Tavolato. We will have the first part of the webinar, which will be dedicated to the geopolitical aspects, and then we will have the energy consequences of this crisis. Thank you very much, and I hope you will enjoy our webinar. Over to you, Umberto.
Good morning to everyone, and I would like to thank the president of the foundations, Enrico Mattei, and Federico Pontoni for having organized this seminar. We are glad from the Medora Italian foundations to be partnering with you and join forces to try to understand better the implication and scenario of what has happened in the Middle East in the last 3 weeks. I will start with a brief background presentation so that we can focus with our speakers on the implications and scenario and key considerations. 2 days before the 6th round of US-Iran negotiation was scheduled to take place in Oman, Israel launched direct military strikes against Iran and Islamic Republic of Iran. Israeli fighter jets, missiles, and drones targeted Iran's military leadership, ballistic missile capabilities, and nuclear program for 12 consecutive days. President Trump had initially pushed back against military intervention, instead preferring to engage in direct talks with Iran. But Trump's inability to move the talks to a successful conclusion over several months made him change his mind. He first demanded an unconditional surrender of Iran, and then decided to give the Iranians 2 weeks. And finally, 2 days later, he ordered attacks on Fordo, the core of Iran's nuclear enrichment program, located under a mountain of 100 meters of rocks. Striking that program required direct American intervention. And as the US is the only one to have such military capability, it could have been only done by the Americans. In retaliation, Iran struck missile back on the United States Al-Udeid base in Qatar. However, they warned the US in advance, ensuring that such attack would cause no casualties, risking blowback from the Americans. The attack, which was presented to the Iranian public as a victory, instead was widely perceived as a capitulation. President Trump publicly accepted this for what it was, praising the Iranians for restraint and announcing a ceasefire, which is now in place. Nevertheless, it appeared that Iran was able to remove much of its highly enriched uranium stockpile before the Americans' attacks at Fordo, and the Iranian nuclear program has not been totally destroyed. The United States has now resumed efforts for negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. However, it remains to be seen whether and how Iran will engage in negotiation, and how much is it willing to concede, or instead, whether a hardliner stance will prevail in Tehran, and that Iran would decide to go instead dark by kicking out the International Atomic Energy Agency and leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm pleased to discuss this with our distinguished speakers today, and I would start from Sima Shine. Sima Shine has been already introduced, but I would like to say more. She's a senior advisor at the Institute of National Security Studies based in Tel Aviv. Before, for most of her career, Ms. Shine served in the Israeli intelligence community, including as head of research and evaluation division of the Mossad. Moreover, she has also served as deputy head of strategic affairs in the Israeli National Security Council and as deputy general in the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, where she was also responsible for the Iranian file. She's now working for the INSS, and her views that will be expressed today are her views, and she's in no way representing the government of Israel. Sima, I would like to ask you my first questions. As I have presented you, you have been following Iran throughout all your career for the Israeli government, and now as an independent researcher. The threat of Iran building a nuclear bomb has been there for all along, but Israel never dared to go to war with Iran. Why did Prime Minister Netanyahu decide to strike now? Can you give us some background, please?
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me. And let me say there are, I would say, 3 levels of answer. The first level is the level of the immediate, why now, the immediate reasons. I will say 2 of them, and the most important one was steps that the Iranian scientists dealing with weaponization were doing in the last year, small steps that could be somehow presented as dual use, but where since the people who were dealing with it were the people of the weaponization, there is no question that it was within the framework of weaponization and within the understanding that they are doing small steps that will enable them to be in a better position when the leader will give the directive to go for a nuclear device. I have to remind us that this was happening within the context of the last year of a lot of loudly speaking in Iran of people that were relevant to the issues in the past and not currently, but very important people saying that Iran after the war and after what happened to the proxies has to improve its deterrence, and probably it should be done through nuclear capability. So the first and the foremost and most important issue right now is the issue of the nuclear science that Israel had in the intelligence, as well as what the Iranians themselves have been saying. Now, one has to remember the last report of the IAEA that was published in May, and the one that the Board of Governors has said that Iran is in non-compliance, actually said what everybody knew, but it is a formal agency, saying that Iran has 408 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which if everybody knows that if you enrich it to 90 plus, it will give enough fissile material for 10 devices. So this is only the formal situation. And of course, if you combine all this together, there was a growing concern in Israel that Iran, on one hand, was talking to the Americans in 5 rounds with no advance on this diplomatic channel, and actually wasting time in order to complete different steps that they have been doing in order to be in a better situation to break out once they decide to do it. The second reason, and I said this is the most important one, the second one was the advancement on the ballistic missiles production. As we all saw during the war, these ballistic missiles, most of them were intercepted, but not all of them. And those that were not intercepted made a huge damage to houses, to people, killed people. It's a massive weapon, different size, different warheads, and quite damaging. To that, I would also add the window of opportunity. The window of opportunity is what I see as the collapse of the proxies, of most of the proxies of Iran, and within that, the collapse of the deterrence that Iran has built for years around Israel. Now, I want to say that is the second level, and the third one, as I said, there are 3 levels. The third one is the strategic context. Here I want to say Iran was for years planning and executing a program how to hurt Israel dramatically. I don't want to use dramatic words like annihilate Israel or something, because I don't think they can do it, but a huge destruction on Israel. And the 7th of October was not an invention of Hamas out of the blue, out of the sky. They have been for some years sitting together with the IRGC, with Hezbollah, with the Houthis and the Iraqi militias in a war room in Beirut, planning how to start a combined multi-front war against Israel in order to they called it to destroy Israel. I hope they couldn't destroy, but they have been using these words. And I want to emphasize, even though Iran didn't know that it is going to happen on the 7th of October, without Iran, it wouldn't happen. All the weapons that were sent to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to Jihadic Islam, missiles to the Houthis, missiles to the Iraqi militias, without Iran training, financing, and the missiles, as I said, and others, nothing would have happened in the Middle East. So from Israel's point of view, this is the strategic context of the decision that was made because of very real steps in the weaponization program, but were within this strategic context.
Thank you very much. Now the war is over. There is a ceasefire. What we see is, despite successful military strikes against the top leaderships of Iran, because the strikes were not just done to the nuclear facility, but also they killed important members of the Iran leadership. Despite the attacks, Iran's regime stability today remains uncontested. At least we don't see any significant signs of a regime change in Iran. And if it is true that Iran was able to remove much, if not all, of its highly enriched uranium stockpile from Fordo before the American strikes, and if it is true that its nuclear program has not been destroyed totally, then my question is, what are the strategic achievements, objectives that Israel has managed to gain from this war?
So let me start by saying what was achieved, and of course you are very correct by saying that the material probably was not destroyed. I'll say a word about that later. First of all, not by priority, I should mention the destruction of centers of knowledge with the scientists that were assassinated. All of them were part of the weaponization group. Israel for years was following them, knew exactly what they are doing, was following their activity in the last year, and some of the steps I mentioned before were done by those people. So the center of knowledge on weaponization, I think, is not completely destroyed, of course, and there are many other scientists, but they were very important centers of knowledge. The second achievement is it looks that there are three main sites that were targeted. The first one is Natanz, the big facility of enrichment. As far as I understand, and everything is only on open sources and on IAEA and others, probably most, if not all, of the centrifuge were destroyed. I don't know to say if the place is impossible to reconstruct, but probably quite difficult, but this is still an issue to be understood in the future. The other site is Fa'an, was, from what I understand, much more destroyed. And here we are talking about two important elements. One is the conversion of natural uranium to UF6 that is being used in the centrifuge. And the second is conversion to metal uranium, which is a very important component, actually, and a component that without you cannot have a nuclear device. So both of these, as far as I understand, were destroyed. And the third is the issue of Fordow. As you correctly say, this was struck by the Americans from very beginning of information coming out. It looks as if the centrifuge that were operating in Fordow were destroyed. I don't know to say about, as I didn't know to say about Natanz, whether the site is in a situation that Iran cannot reconstruct. So that I don't know. I don't think the Iranians yet know it, but this will be revealed in the future. What you have mentioned, the material. So as the Iranians have said before the war, they say that they have taken the material to different places. I don't know if the Israeli and other intelligence know where it is, but for sure they have taken them out. The issue is one, whether they, and the second thing that I want to mention is that we don't know, but I assume that because there was no inspection in the last 4 years on the construction of advanced centrifuge, that probably Iran has somewhere advanced centrifuge in a secret site. So the combination of material and advanced centrifuge somewhere, if I'm correct, can bring Iran to enrichment to 90+% and perhaps doing something on the weaponization in a secret place. Whether Iran will do it immediately or in a year or will not, or decide not to do it, nobody knows for the time being. I think we are too close to the event. What we know already is that Iran has said that it is not going to cooperate with the inspection of the IAEA. They didn't leave the NPT, but they say they are not going to cooperate. We don't know if it's forever or for a while in order to understand what happened. I saw someone, I think it's the foreign minister, someone else, that has said that if and when they will come back to cooperation with the IAEA, they will demand the removal of Rafael Grossi, the General Secretary, which of course Iran cannot demand it, but that means that perhaps they will come to any kind of inspection in the future. And the second question that we don't have an answer is whether they will go for negotiations with the Americans on a future, any kind of an agreement. Of course, it will be preferable if they go to an agreement and if the issues that are on the table, and one of them, of course, and the most important is the material, if it's possible to make sure that the IAEA inspect and give a report on what is there. But we are, as I said, too close to the events, and the Iranians have, I think, haven't yet decided when and how they will go in both directions, with the IAEA and with the Americans on an agreement.
Very clear. That was my other question that I wanted to ask. So then I will go to a slightly different question and topic, which is about Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Before this war with Iran, his government was on the verge of collapse because of problems in his own coalition. Following the war with Iran, it seems to be in a much stronger position, both domestically and geopolitically. Does this mean that he is much more comfortable and more likely to agree or to implement a ceasefire in Gaza, as it was announced by Trump earlier today? And do you see any scenarios for any election sooner in Israel?
Yes, so first of all, I think this government, first of all, the government was not on the verge of collapse because he enlarged a little bit the government, so he has enough hands in the parliament. But to your question, which is more important, the issue of Gaza, as you know, and if not, I'll say it, I support very much, and many others that in the Institute, a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages, and a new government, a civilian government in Gaza, replacing Hamas, a government or governance that will be combined by 4 Arab countries in the region and the component of the Palestinian Authority, and a gradual but agreed process of disarming Hamas. You have to understand, before I say some words about any agreement and any regional agreements, which I think are very important, I want to say one thing. It's difficult from sitting, since I love Rome so much, and you know it, and this is Italy, one of the favorite states for me. It's very difficult from Rome to understand what happened in Israel on the 7th of October. Everyone, all the Israelis, including me and everyone, is under trauma, huge trauma. This is not a war. It's not a one more war. Israel had a lot of wars. We knew how to handle wars. This is something different. This is something people came into the houses of people sleeping in their beds with the children and killed them. This is something completely different from anything Israel has suffered in its 77 years. And this is a trauma that nobody can understand if you are not living here and understanding the issue. And therefore, Hamas cannot stay as the ruler of Gaza. Nobody in Israel, left, right, center, no question, doesn't want to see Hamas in Gaza. This is something that will not enable people to go back to live in the proximity of the border. You have to understand, the border is nothing. It's 200 meters, 300 meters. It's impossible to go back to live there if people know that Hamas is ruling Gaza. And therefore, I think it is very important to make sure that Gaza is not ruled by Hamas. I understand it's impossible to disarm them from every Kalashnikov and everything, but there should be enough understanding and enough involvement of the Arab states and of the international community and the perimeter that Israel is controlling on the border that makes the life of the people on the border possible to go back to their houses. Now to say about, I do believe that we are very close to that. I think we are closer than we were before because of the visit of the Prime Minister next week in Washington. And I think first of all, he will get the support, even if the two radical parties in the government will leave the government. And I don't think the two will leave. I think one might leave. But if they leave, he has the support of the opposition on making an arrangement in Gaza. And I think that will happen. And one One last
Yes.
sentence. Let me say one last sentence. I think we are in the beginning of a process in the Middle East that will be a different Middle East. In Lebanon, in Syria, of course in Gaza, and I hope also with our friends in Egypt and Jordan.
Thank you very much, Sima. We are a bit late in our agenda, but I wanted to make sure that the issue of Gaza was also touched, and we do hope that we are very close to a ceasefire, like you have highlighted. Now, I would like to give the floor. Stay with us, please, because there will be a question after. I would like to give the floor to Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics. He's an adjunct assistant professor also at Georgetown University and an adjunct fellow at the American Security Project. He is an expert on the Gulf regions, and he features very often in Gulf and American media as a commentator, and is very reliable and trusted collaborator also of Medoro Italian Foundation. So, Giorgio, the floor is yours, and I would like to focus. You are speaking from Washington, and I would like you to focus first on what is the Arab perspectives that you have felt during your consultations at the before and at the moment on the war. Before we talk about the American perspective and then some scenarios. I would like to, keep your interventions of 10 minutes. I will interrupt you with some questions in between so that there is space for also the other speaker and question and answer. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really wonderful to be with all of you today. When we look at the Israel-Iran conflict from the perspective of the Gulf Arab monarchies, it's really important for us to understand the extent to which the GCC states find the situation to be so terrifying. In the Gulf states, the focus right now is really on promoting stability in the region. Countries like Saudi Arabia has its Vision 2030 agenda, and the other GCC states have their own economic diversification and development agendas. They're trying to attract a tremendous amount of foreign direct investment, more business, more tourism, as they're trying to transition to the post-oil era. None of that is going to be possible if there are conflicts in the region, especially ones that have potential to spill into the GCC states. So again, the GCC countries want Iran and Israel to de-escalate as quickly as possible so that some more stability can prevail in the region. To be sure, if these economic diversification agendas do not succeed, there will eventually come a big crash in these countries down the road. So making sure that the countries can end their dependence on oil and gas is the top priority right now. And within this context, we've seen the countries in the GCC that were historically on most hostile or tense terms with Iran, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They've tried to mitigate their tensions with Iran and open up a new chapter in relations with the Islamic Republic that's based more on diplomacy and engagement. And we obviously saw that almost 2.5 years ago with Saudi Arabia renormalizing its diplomatic relations with Iran. And right now, the GCC states, such as Saudi Arabia, I think want to see to it that the conflict dynamics in the region don't result in these this new sort of era of détente with Tehran coming to an end. So the GCC countries are trying hard to preserve their somewhat normalized relations with Iran, but they're also under some more pressure right now because they all depend on the United States as a security guarantor. And so, of course, they naturally have huge concerns about what would happen in the event of a full-blown war between the United States and Iran. They would come under a lot of pressure to sort of pick sides. They certainly do not want to face that type of a dilemma. So bringing us to where we are today in light of the ceasefire agreement that that President Trump cajoled Israel and Iran into entering, the GCC states really want to see to it that the ceasefire, as fragile and precarious as it is, they want to see it hold up. And I think it'll be interesting to look at the role of the United Arab Emirates, a country that has normalized relationships with both Iran as well as Israel. It is the only country in the GCC that has this unique situation, this unique standing with both the Islamic Republic and Israel. So at this very difficult time in the region in which there is a lack of trust between Iran on one side and the American-Israeli alliance on the other side, I think the GCC states are going to do what they can to open up back channels of diplomacy and to see to it that a dialogue can move ahead with the aim of trying to make this ceasefire more durable. Because right now, I think one of the biggest questions facing the Middle East is whether or not this ceasefire between Israel and Iran is one that can hold and prevent us from going back to war, prevent the region from going back to this war, or if this is merely just a pause at the beginning of a much longer drawn out conflict. And of course, the GCC states are going to do everything they can. Granted, there are limits to their influence, limits to the leverage they have. But nonetheless, I think the Qataris, the Emiratis, Omanis, and Saudis will do everything they can to try to open up these channels of diplomacy in the interest of making this truce last as long as possible. As they see it, the task is difficult, but there are no other options. Just to repeat, unfreezing of the Israel-Iran war or a resumption of direct confrontations between the US and Iran has potential to prove absolutely disastrous from the standpoint of all 6 GCC countries. And also, when we talk about the Iranian nuclear threat, there is a serious nuclear threat to the environment of the GCC states. If Iran's nuclear reactor at Bushehr is going to be hit in the event of a future conflict, there's a risk of waters in the Gulf being contaminated. And for the majority of the GCC states that depend on their desalination plants, in the event of the waters of the Gulf being contaminated, this could make some of the cities in the GCC uninhabitable. So from even an environmental standpoint, the stakes are very, very high for the GCC states. This concerns fundamental questions about human survival on the Arabian Peninsula in the event of such a nuclear catastrophe. Then, of course, we have to consider the possibility, even if remote, nonetheless, there is a possibility of Iran responding to further attacks by closing down the Strait of Hormuz. For the majority of GCC states, this would be beyond disastrous for their economies. And they, for all of these reasons, want to do everything they can to try to see to it that diplomacy can prevail and that Iran and Israel do not return to the war that we witnessed last month.
If I can ask specifically, you touched all the point, I believe. So how, at the moment, how can the ceasefire hold if there is no resumptions of negotiations on the nuclear issues with Iran? Sima before has said that there is still uncertainty whether Iran wants to engage in negotiations or not. What are your 2-3 main scenarios of what could happen and how likely they are? And if I can ask you to be within 3 minutes so that then we can move to question and answer. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I will be honest, when it comes to this very opaque and fragile ceasefire, I am not very optimistic. I would like to see it hold, but I think there are many factors that give us valid concerns about it collapsing at any moment, unfortunately. I think the Iranians are going to do everything they can to try to establish deterrence capacity. They do not want Iran to be another country like Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, that Israel can just, that basically it becomes very normalized for Israel to bomb. They want to deter the Israelis from bombing their homeland, and for decades sort of this forward defense doctrine worked, and that did establish a form of deterrence. But now the Iranians have come to terms with the fact that this does not work. So to answer your question, what I think we may see, I think there's a good chance Iran will withdraw from the NPT and now rush toward a nuclear weapon. In the event that that happens, I do not imagine that Israel and the US are going to sit back and not take military action. I'm sure the Israelis and possibly the Americans too would resume attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, possibly just setting the nuclear program back. And then Iran will try to dig deeper and continue a clandestine nuclear program, and we will have basically a game of cat and mouse that goes on for a long time. Unfortunately, I think that's the most likely scenario. To be clear, the US military strikes did not destroy Iran's nuclear program. Trump is incorrect when he says that that took place, and I am convinced that the leadership in Israel will continue to see a nuclear threat from Iran. And like I said, sort of this game of cat and mouse in which the Iranians continue to work on their nuclear program, and it will not be a transparent nuclear program anymore. And Israel and possibly the US will resume military strikes on Iran, and there will be a lot less stability in the region. This idea that Iran is going to come back to the negotiating table and make concessions on the nuclear front, I do not see that happening. I do not think that there is any trust, and we need to also keep in mind that there is a lot of pressure, bottom-up pressure from Iran society on the government. There are growing calls from average Iranians to pull out of the NPT and to develop a nuclear weapon and to not negotiate with the Americans. The hardliners who pushed for this before have views that are now more popular in Iran because of everything that happened in June.
Giorgio, I think you have highlighted clearly your scenarios. I would like to give the floor to Andreas Economou, Head of Oil and Oil Research at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and former OIES Saudi Aramco Fellow. Andreas, welcome. I think that we have covered the geopolitical part, and you are here today to give us a presentations on the implications and scenarios for the energy market. Please, the floor is yours.
I do have some slides to share. So yes, so the 12-day war marked the first direct conflict between Israel and Iran, and ignited geopolitical risks in the oil-rich Middle East region over fears of supply disruptions and oil flows. Now, at the time of the conflict, uncertainty was extremely high over fears that vital energy infrastructure would be targeted, and what would be the response, whether the US would be involved, and the conflict escalated to the wider Middle East region, all of which created a wide range of potential risks to oil supplies as a response. But the two central risk factors that prevailed were the physical supply disruptions to oil production, processing, and export facilities in Iran and other Gulf Arab producers, and of course, the security of flows via the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if we were to group the three main risk scenarios that prevailed in the commentary in ascending order of significance, this would be the conflict remaining contained and isolated between Iran and Israel, entailing some disruptions in Iranian volumes. The conflict spilling over to the wider Middle East region, essentially supply disruptions spilling over to Gulf producers, and the more severe escalation with a blockade or disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, looking at the market reaction, as you see from the graph, the initial oil price response was significant. Oil prices in June 13 recording the largest one-day rise since 22, up by 7%. But oil prices did remain confined in the high 70s on a daily basis for the duration, hitting a high of nearly $79 per barrel June 19. That is despite the sharp spike in geopolitical risks and uncertainty. And this essentially shows that oil markets did price in the associated risks, but refrained from overreacting to unfolding events and the wide range of potential outcomes. Price volatility also jumped to a 3-year high, but again, it held off to half the level seen in 22 following the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, the response of the whole of the oil complex was to strengthen. Along with front-month prices, we also saw calendar spreads for key benchmarks and regional crudes also jumping to multi-month highs. The forward curves returned to back to full impact quotation after having shifted to contango structure before the war. And the impact on refining margins was mixed. But it is important to note that even before the ceasefire agreement, the oil market began to show some adaptation at price risks, especially as compared to past episodes. That is, with the risk premium remaining contained and even receding before erasing all gains as supply concerns completely eased, quickly responding to the ceasefire deal on June 24. Now, this goes a long way to show how resilient the oil markets have become, especially compared to past geopolitical episodes in the Middle East, and to some extent is also telling about the distinction between traders and observers / speculators' expectations and risk assessment throughout this geopolitical episode. With that, examining in more detail the 3 prevailing geopolitical risk scenarios that prevail, and starting with the conflict remaining contained between the two. The isolated conflict scenario entails risks remaining contained to Iranian supplies. Now, Iran has been producing around 3.3 million barrels per day since mid-2024, growing annually by 400 kbd in 24, and by 1 million barrels per day since the start of 21, despite the enforcement of sanctions. At the same time, Iranian oil exports also grew by more than 1 million barrels per day since the start of 21, more than 9% of which originated from the Gulf Island, and in 24, around 80% of which were destined to independent refiners in China. The immediate risk was for the Gulf Island to be targeted, disrupting some 1.8 million barrels per day of Iranian volumes and incapacitating the export ability of Iran. In this event, our forecast scenarios suggest that the Brent impact would have pushed prices in the 70s range, all else remaining equal. The second scenario involved the escalation of the conflict to the wider Middle East region, with the umbrella of supply risks expanding to the whole of Arab Gulf state producers. Gulf state, excluding Oman, account for around 30% of global oil production, 10% of global refinery processing, including core OPEC producers such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq. Now, such an attack would not have been unprecedented, as in 2019, drone and missiles attacks targeted Saudi Arabia's largest oil processing facility and one of Saudi Arabia's major oil fields, causing the largest single-day global supply disruption in history by some 5.7 million barrels per day. Oil prices jumped by around 20% in a single day, but disruptions were short-lived as Aramco restored 50% of the disruptions in production within 48 hours and the full disruptions within 2 weeks. It's also important to note that the region holds the world's only available spare capacity cushion, held mainly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And with this in mind, we estimated that a high probability assigned to such an event could have pushed prices in the 80s, 90s range, and above 90s in the event of an actual physical supply disruption in a key producing country such as Saudi Arabia. Lastly, in the severe escalation case, reflecting the risk of blockade or disruption of oil flows passing from the Strait of Hormuz, leading to a sharp reduction of oil exports from the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most vital choke points for global energy security, not only for oil, but also LNG. Roughly 20% of global oil supply passes through this passage, and around 85% of total crude Gulf and products exports. Now, The Middle East Gulf region exports around 21 million barrels per day of crude and products, of which around 70 million barrels per day are via the Strait of Hormuz, and more than 80% of that is destined to Asia. Now, looking at this possibility, the strait has never been fully closed, and a physical blockade was never attempted despite Iran's threats over time. The most severe episode was during the 1980s Iran-Iraq War and the Tanker War. But also Iran, by blocking the strait, apart from being self-damaging, it would also hurt its key customers with limited impact on exports to the US and other Western countries. Now, there is a possibility of some flows to be redirected, for example, via the Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline that has a capacity of 5 million barrels per day and can be temporarily expanded to 7 million barrels per day, and via UAE's around 1.5 million barrels per day pipeline capacity to its Fujairah export terminal. Also, the presence of a strong international deterrence power that could mean that even if Iran attempted to do so, any blockade or closure would have been short-lived. And finally, there were contingency measures in place, both for consumers and producers. For example, a surge in strategic stockpiling before the war in China would have allowed to fill the gap in case oil flows to the strait were jeopardized. And some producers report that they may have reallocated oil volumes overseas to storage in case supply routes were disrupted. But that said, as a single most vulnerable point in the global oil supply chain, and considering the large amount of oil volumes passing through, even fears of a blockade or only a modest disruption in the strait would have been enough to impact oil prices. And for this scenario, we do model prices making a push in the 100s momentarily. Now, moving to the actual risk premium during the episode, we assessed that based on our structural EAR model of the world oil market. We estimate the difference between the Brent price realization between June 13 to 24 and our no change forecast for the month of June prior to the episode. For the purposes of the exercise, the predicted value of Brent for June based on the no change forecast averaged $7.8 per barrel, and our estimate shows and suggests that the implied geopolitical risk premium during the duration of the whole episode averaged around $5 per barrel, reaching a high of $8 in June 2019. Near all of the risk premium was raised on June 23 following the conflict de-escalation and before reversing on the eve of the ceasefire announcement on June 24. Now, as it is shown on the left-hand side, scenario analysis implies that market participants priced in the isolated conflict case, including the loss of some Iranian volumes, but they did assign low probabilities in the escalatory scenarios. We estimate around 25% probability of the war escalating to the wider Middle East region and 50% probability leading to the blockade or disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. The de-escalation case in our analysis is Brent prices retreating in the $64 and $68 per barrel range compared to the actual 67 that Brent hovered in the first week following the ceasefire deal. And on the right-hand side, we can see that graphs observed open interest for Brent, call options for August expiration. We do see that, and in support of this analysis, that the initial elevated interest at $90 and $100 per barrel price rise was quickly reversed, while interest for contracts above 100 remained low throughout. And in the aftermath of the Israel-Iran war, geopolitical risks in our balances have receded sharply, and they're now near balance for the remainder of 25 and 26. President Trump has, on June 25th, has even floated the idea of opening discussion of lifting Iranian oil sanctions, although since then he conflicted these earlier remarks by threatening harsher sanctions. It's important here to stand for a second on the possibility of Iranian sanctions relief. While there remain another 500 KBD before Iranian reaches maximum capacity at 3.8 from current levels, it is uncertain whether Iran could materially increase production further from here. In terms of flows, we do not expect major shifts, as the Israel-Iran war has made heavily dependent importers like Europe wary of the vulnerabilities, but alternative options remain limited, considering also the sanctions on Russian oil. And lastly, where prices have receded, heavy and medium sour crudes. Pressure on heavy and medium sour crudes could persist as depending on how fast the OPEC can roll back their cuts and the volatile sanctions policies affecting the availability of such grades elsewhere. In terms of the balance of risks, with geopolitical risks receding, the balance price risk has tilted to the downside again, and this is dominated by demand-side pressures. For the second half of the year, reference forecast sees Brent returning in the 60-70 range, to average 69 for the full year, and finishing off with a few high-level remarks on supply-demand fundamentals. So far in the year, projections of massive surpluses building in 2025 did not materialize. Global demand outlook, growth outlook remains steady at 1.1 million barrels per day, but we do note exceptionally high global trade policy uncertainty persisting. On the second half of the year, focus is on China. Latest data progress has shown the Chinese oil demand held at the high end, on the high end of the forecast, 250 to 300 kbd. Elsewhere, oil demand estimates remain resilient, with the US remaining supportive to the OECD outlook despite the trade uncertainty. And on the supply side, of course, OPEC 8 monthly production hikes for April and May have so far undershot planned targets despite accelerations. We would expect now essentially to see that producers outside Saudi Arabia and the UAE may struggle or may abide by the compensation plans, and we wouldn't see the whole of the 2.4 million barrels per day original plan coming back into the market. US supply, which was the main source of non-OPEC plus supply growth in previous years, not becoming a headwind for the non-OPEC supply outlook. We do not see a contraction this year or the next, but we do essentially see growth slowing, softening further from 24, from 250 kbd to 150 this year and to 80 kbd next year. But outside the US, Americas are supported to the non-OPEC plus supply outlook. Here again, we note that this production growth from these countries failed to meet high expectations in previous years, noting Brazil. Importantly, global oil stocks remain under pressure. Global crude stocks, excluding China, remain at multi-year low levels. And with all this in mind, we continue to forecast the oil market near balance in 25 before building into a small surplus in 2026. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I think we have almost 200 participants, so the questions are a lot. And Federico is managing them, and I leave the floor to him so that he can convey those questions to the participants.
Yes, so thank you.
I'm sorry.
We cannot hear you, Federico.
Can you hear me now? Yes, sorry. So we have many questions concerning the relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So whether there is any possibility of a formal agreement and mutual recognition between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then we have questions concerning the role of China. So not just from a political point of view, but also from a more oil market point of view. So whether we were just discussing the low level of stocks, whether Chinese traders and Chinese market operators might try to either increase their purchases or diversify, particularly if they do not believe to this ceasefire. And there is then another question. So there is it looks like that the market believes in the ceasefire and in no further tensions, while on the other hand, the statements made in particular by Professor Cafiero were of the opposite side, that he is seeing more tensions along the way. So they want to have some comments also on this. So we can start first from the relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then I would ask this question both to Ms. Shine and to Professor Cafiero. and then we move to China. And again, it could be both Professor Cafiero and then Andreas Economou. Thank you.
Thank you. The issue of Israel, Saudi Arabia is on the table all the time. First of all, I want to say that I agree completely with what was said about the fact that the Gulf states and of course, Saudi Arabia didn't want the war, didn't want the prolongation of the war, and they were terrified from being involved in this war. But all sides, Israel and Iran and the US, didn't want to be in a situation that the Gulf states are involved, and therefore I think for the time being, I don't think any harm to those countries and to their economic interests. As to the bilateral relations, I think it's not a secret anymore that there are many different connections under the radar, as we call it. But I don't see, if to put the bottom line, I don't see a full normalization as long as there is no advancement. First of all, as long as there is no end to the war in Gaza, no question about that. And I think also a kind of a beginning of a political process with the Palestinian Authority, something that gives a future, a vision for the future. I think without that, we'll not see a full normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I would say Israel understands it, and the fact that the Trump administration trying to find different ways to put some steps on the road for better relations is very important, because at the end of the day, the region wants to be a region of cooperation and not a region of wars. And if there is one of the reasons that the Hamas decided to start the war on the 7th of October was in order to prevent normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So this process is a very positive one and a very stabilizing one, but I don't see it happening very soon.
Yeah, I agree. I think the relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia are going to remain informal for the foreseeable future. I do not imagine Saudi Arabia entering the Abraham Accords. I think that the Saudi leadership has been very sincere when they say time and time again that Riyadh is remaining true to the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002. That continues to be the kingdom's policy. And if anything, I would say in the past nearly 21 months of warfare in Gaza, the Saudis have sort of doubled down on this position, and support for a Palestinian state has become increasingly important to sort of the purpose of sort of the identity of Saudi Arabia's foreign policy in the region, if anything. And we're seeing some very strong statements from leadership in Saudi Arabia on this issue. Just a few other points to bring up that help explain why I feel that it's unlikely that Saudi Arabia is going to join the Abraham Accords. It's difficult to exaggerate how unpopular that move would be within Saudi society. There is a consensus among Saudis that Israel is guilty of a genocide in Gaza. And if Mohammed bin Salman were to bring the kingdom into the normalization camp right now, that could potentially be a driver of instability within the kingdom. And that's the last thing that the Saudi leadership wants. I would also say that Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords would be a gift to Iranian regime narratives about Saudi Arabia being beholden to the West and Iran being the only Islamic country that does anything to defend the Palestinian cause. And so I don't think the Saudi leadership wants to see the Islamic Republic score a propaganda victory, which it absolutely would if Saudi Arabia were to join the Abraham Accords in light of everything that Israel has done in Gaza since October 2023. And lastly, there's also this final question. What is it that Saudi Arabia would gain from formalizing diplomatic relations with Israel that could justify taking all of those risks? I think Trump is very close to Mohammed bin Salman already. This was something that maybe in the aftermath of the Jamal Khashoggi murder would have served Saudi Arabia's interests when there was a crisis with Saudi Arabia's standing in the West. But right now, I think Saudi Arabia has a very strong standing before the US and Western governments. And so there's even less incentive for Riyadh to make a move that would be extremely risky just to improve its standing with Western governments.
Consideration on the role of China, and then we move to also Professor Economou.
In terms of, sorry for it. Try go on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of China, China was very wary since the US tightened sanctions early in the year on the importance of essentially building up its stocks, its crude stocks, and it started building from there. Over the past 4 months, they did increase stocks by 750,000 barrels per day, estimates put it, and this allowed them essentially to curb their intake during the 12-day this 12-day period. So there is a contingency and some room for China to maneuver there, but there is also an increasing pressure not to see any disruptions in the region. There are sanctions, targeted sanctions on Russia, and there could be more coming in the second half of the year from Europe. There are sanctions in Venezuelan crude, and these are, and now with the Iran war, these are three important crudes in China's imports mix, and of course, any disruptions, further disruptions there, it will be something that China would like to see.
Yes, and there is one final question concerning the trade sanctions over Iran. Do you see any, at least just for oil, do you see any change over the next weeks and months and therefore the possibility then for European countries and companies to buy oil from Iran?
The signals are mixed from the US. There is a confusion there, but tightening the sanctions, I don't think that it will have much impact. We've seen this in the past 1 year, that enforcing those sanctions is a different story from the narrative. And with the relief of sanctions, this will make the pricing of Iranian crude become more expensive, and this will be something that essentially will put pressure on Chinese intake again.
I will add to that if there is no agreement between Iran and the US in the coming weeks, I assume there will be a snapback, which is bringing back the sanctions through a Security Council, which is part of the JCPOA, and I think the Europeans are ready for that.
I don't know whether there is any view on this from Professor Cafiero.
Nothing to add.
Okay, so then thank you very much again for all the insights and also for your availability. And I also want to thank all the many participants that we had during this webinar, and which has unfortunately come to a close. And I thank again all the speakers. I thank you very much. And of course, we hope to organize an update and hopefully a good and peaceful update very soon on this. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.